Zoe Harper was no ordinary student. At 15, she was known for her sharp intellect, her strong-willed personality, and an uncompromising sense of justice. Raised in a family that valued resilience and integrity, Zoe had always been taught to stand up for herself and others, even when it wasn't the easiest path. Her father, Leo Harper, a former detective turned private investigator, had instilled in her a deep understanding of right and wrong. She was a girl who couldn't turn a blind eye to injustice, and this quality made her both respected and feared among her classmates at Ridgefield Academy, a prestigious yet notoriously conservative private school. Ridgefield was a school that prided itself on tradition, discipline, and high academic standards, but beneath the polished exterior lay a culture of subtle discrimination. While the institution advertised itself as progressive, many students and staff harbored outdated beliefs and biases that were silently tolerated. Zoe, one of the few black students in her grade, often felt the unspoken scrutiny of teachers and students alike. Despite her exemplary academic record, she knew that many viewed her as an outsider. One of Ridgefield's most respected but feared teachers was Miss Linda Carmichael, a strict, no-nonsense history teacher who had been with the school for over 2 decades. In her mid-50s, with a reputation as an old-school disciplinarian, Miss Carmichael held absolute control over her classroom. She was known for her uncompromising teaching methods, but few knew about the depths of her biases, which she carefully concealed behind a guise of authority. Miss Carmichael had grown up in a different era and held firm to her beliefs, often showing favoritism towards students from wealthy, traditional backgrounds while subtly belittling those she deemed less worthy of Ridgefield's standards. From the first day Zoe set foot in Miss Carmichael's class, there was a silent tension between them. Zoe's confidence, her keen mind, and her willingness to question everything seemed to provoke something dark in her teacher. Miss Carmichael saw Zoe not as a bright young girl but as a challenge to her authority. And for a woman like Carmichael, challenges had to be quashed. Zoe's unwillingness to blindly accept what she was told, her insistence on looking deeper, asking questions, and even disagreeing with historical interpretations, made her a target. The situation reached its peak one fateful afternoon during a lesson on the civil rights movement. As Miss Carmichael lectured, Zoe noticed subtle inaccuracies in her words, minor omissions that painted the movement in a subdued light, sidestepping the brutality faced by those who fought for justice. Carmichael portrayed the movement as a peaceful process that didn't disrupt the existing order too much, which was far from the truth. Zoe, unable to stay silent, raised her hand. "Excuse me, Miss Carmichael," she said calmly but firmly. "Don't you think it's important to include the violence and repression that people endured? The movement wasn't just a polite conversation. People risked their lives and faced real danger to bring about change." The room fell silent. Students turned to Zoe, some with respect, others with discomfort. It was rare for anyone to question Miss Carmichael, let alone contradict her directly. The teacher's face hardened, her mouth pressing into a thin line as she met Zoe's gaze. "Zoe," she began, her tone icy, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm for the subject, I am the teacher here. This curriculum is designed to give students a balanced view of history, not to indulge personal agendas." Zoe felt a chill run through her, but she didn't back down. "It's not about a personal agenda, Miss Carmichael. It's about understanding the full story. We owe it to the people who sacrificed so much." Miss Carmichael's eyes narrowed. "Enough, Zoe! I won't have you disrupting my class. If you feel so strongly, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate some humility for everyone here." Zoe's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just asking for a more complete picture of history." The teacher's patience snapped. Then get down on your knees and apologize for your arrogance, she ordered, her voice laced with venom. The command shocked the entire classroom. Zoe stared at Miss Carmichael, disbelief and indignation flooding her. She could see the satisfaction in her teacher's eyes, the twisted pleasure of exerting control over someone she viewed as insubordinate. The room was so silent, Zoe could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Zoe's initial instinct was to refuse, to call out the blatant injustice of what was happening. But as she glanced around the room, she saw the faces of her classmates, some curious, others frightened, a few looking away as if hoping not to be implicated. If she defied Miss Carmichael now, it would only lead to more punishment, perhaps even suspension. She thought of her parents, the sacrifices they'd made to get her into Ridgefield, and a strange, bitter resignation filled her. This wasn't about her pride or her own feelings. This was about surviving the system she found herself trapped in. Slowly, reluctantly, Zoe knelt on the cold classroom floor, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She felt humiliated, her pride stripped away, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. She wouldn't let Miss Carmichael see her cry or break. Her dignity was all she had left in this moment, and she held on to it fiercely, meeting her teacher's gaze with unflinching eyes. "Good," Miss Carmichael said, a hint of satisfaction creeping into her voice. "Let this be a lesson for anyone else who thinks they can disrupt my classroom with their self-important notions of truth." The moment seemed to stretch forever, and when Miss Carmichael finally ordered her to stand and return to her seat, Zoe felt numb. As she rose and walked back to her desk, she noticed the subdued looks of her classmates. Some seemed to pity her, others quickly looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. Zoe could see the fear Miss Carmichael had instilled in them, a warning to anyone who might consider questioning her authority. Zoe sat down, her mind racing with a mixture of anger, shame, and a fierce determination she hadn't felt before. Miss Carmichael might have thought she'd broken her, but Zoe knew this wasn't over. She would find a way to fight back, to make sure that no one else would have to endure such humiliation. That evening she returned home to her father, her mind replaying the events of the day, each moment like a fresh wound. She knew her father, Leo, had always encouraged her to be resilient, to face adversity with strength. But even he could not have anticipated the type of battle she was now facing. As she told him about the incident, she could see his calm, controlled demeanor slip, anger flashing in his eyes. Leo listened carefully, his jaw clenched as he absorbed every word. When she finished, he looked at her with a resolve that mirrored her own. He promised her that they would find a way to expose Miss Carmichael for who she truly was. They would not go to the administration immediately. He had a different plan in mind, one that would slowly unravel Miss Carmichael's carefully curated facade of authority and respect. In that moment, Zoe felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone in this fight. With her father's support, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead. Miss Carmichael had made a grave mistake. She had turned a quiet, determined girl into someone ready to take a stand, someone who would stop at nothing to ensure justice was served. As Zoe lay awake that night, she felt the first glimmers of hope amidst the anger and shame. She had endured humiliation, but now she would become stronger because of it. The day after the humiliating incident in Miss Carmichael's classroom, Zoe walked through the school halls with her head held high, but her insides felt like they were churning. Everywhere she went, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some with curiosity, others with pity, and a few with contempt. She heard whispers behind her back, hushed murmurs that faded whenever she drew near. It was as if the entire school knew about what had happened, but no one was willing to talk to her directly. Zoe's pride was bruised, and her trust in the school had shattered. Ridgefield Academy had always prided itself on fostering strong minds and critical thinking, but now she saw the institution for what it was, a system that valued obedience over truth, conformity over courage, and worst of all, it had teachers like Miss Carmichael, who wielded their power like weapons, unchallenged and unchecked. After lunch, Zoe received a summons to the principal's office. She was initially hopeful, thinking that perhaps the administration had heard about what happened and wanted to address the teacher's inappropriate behavior. But as she stepped into the principal's office, her optimism faded. Sitting across from Principal Edwards was none other than Miss Carmichael herself, her face set in a cold, triumphant smirk. Principal Edwards, a stern but generally fair-looking man in his early 50s, gestured for Zoe to sit down. She could see the faintest flicker of discomfort in his eyes, as if he knew he was about to do something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Zoe began, folding his hands on the desk. I understand there was an incident in Miss Carmichael's class yesterday. She's brought to my attention some serious concerns regarding your behavior and attitude toward her authority. Zoe's heart sank. This wasn't a meeting to address her teacher's misconduct. It was a reprimand for her. She glanced over at Miss Carmichael, whose expression conveyed nothing but quiet satisfaction. This was her victory lap, Zoe realized. She had twisted the narrative to paint herself as the victim and Zoe as the insubordinate student. Principal Edwards, Zoe started, choosing her words carefully. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I was just asking for a fuller understanding of the civil rights movement. I felt that the version we were presented didn't reflect the truth of what happened. Miss Carmichael interrupted, her voice cold and authoritative. This isn't about the specifics of the history lesson, Zoe. This is about respect. It's about understanding that there are rules in place for a reason, and as a student, you are expected to follow them without challenging the authority of your teachers. Zoe clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her composure. She could feel her anger rising, but she knew that showing it would only play into Miss Carmichael's hands. With all due respect, Miss Carmichael, I don't believe asking questions is the same as being disrespectful. Principal Edwards cleared his throat, cutting off the exchange. Zoe, we encourage intellectual curiosity at Ridgefield, but there's a line between curiosity and defiance. Miss Carmichael has reported that you not only questioned her lesson but also caused a disruption in class. I trust her judgment as a seasoned educator, and I would expect you to respect her experience and knowledge. Zoe's voice wavered, despite her best efforts to remain calm. I wasn't trying to cause a disruption. I just wanted the class to have a complete understanding of history. Principal Edwards sighed, looking at her with what seemed like disappointment. So I don't want to make this into a larger issue. But given Miss Carmichael's report, I'm afraid I have no choice but to place you on academic probation. This will mean that any further incidents, even minor ones, could result in suspension. Is that clear? The words hit Zoe like a physical blow. Academic probation? For asking a question. She fought to keep her composure, but she could feel the humiliation and anger boiling up inside her. This was exactly what Miss Carmichael wanted, a way to silence her, to make her seem like a troublemaker. Zoe could see that the principal was unwilling to challenge the teacher's account, perhaps out of fear of confrontation, or simply because he trusted her more. Yes, sir, Zoe replied quietly, forcing herself to look Principal Edwards wide. It's clear. Miss Carmichael's smirk deepened, but she said nothing further. As Zoe rose to leave, she could feel the weight of defeat settling on her shoulders. She left the principal's office, her mind racing. This was no longer just about a history lesson, it was about her reputation, her future, and her right to be treated fairly. Later that evening, Zoe returned home to her father, who was waiting for her in the living room. Leo could tell from her expression that the meeting hadn't gone well. She recounted the day's events, her voice wavering with anger and frustration, as she explained how Miss Carmichael had twisted the story and turned the administration against her. Leo listened intently, his face hardening with each word. "They put you on probation for questioning a teacher?" he asked, incredulous. "For standing up for historical truth?" Zoe nodded, biting her lip to keep her emotions in check. She made it look like I was being disrespectful, like I was challenging her authority. And Principal Edwards took her side without even listening to my perspective. Leo was silent for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We're not going to let this go, Zoe. I know you want to stand up for yourself, and you did. You did the right thing. But now it's time for me to do what I do best." "What do you mean?" Zoe asked, curiosity and hope flickering in her eyes. Leo gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm going to find out everything I can about Miss Carmichael. This isn't the first time she's acted this way. I'm sure of it. People like her don't just suddenly become bullies. They've usually left a trail." Over the next few days, Leo began digging into Miss Carmichael's background. He called in a few favors from his contacts, searched public records, and quietly reached out to parents of former students. What he discovered only fueled his determination. There were whispers of similar incidents in the past, subtle, undocumented cases where students from minority backgrounds had mysteriously underperformed or had been accused of behavioral issues under her supervision. There were no official complaints, no public scandals, but enough murmurs to suggest a pattern of discrimination. Meanwhile, at school, Zoe faced an increasingly hostile environment. Miss Carmichael was careful not to engage with her directly, but the tension was palpable. Zoe's classmates, influenced by the teacher's thinly veiled comments, began to treat her differently. Friends distanced themselves, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Other students, those who had always resented Zoe's confidence and intelligence, took every opportunity to mock her. She felt isolated, trapped in a school that now seemed determined to undermine her. The following week, Leo managed to track down a former teacher from Ridgefield, Mrs. Eliza Brooks, who had retired a few years earlier. Mrs. Brooks was hesitant at first, wary of stirring up old controversies, but Leo's calm, persuasive manner won her over. She shared that she, too, had witnessed Miss Carmichael's favoritism and her subtle ways of undermining certain students. Mrs. Brooks revealed that she had once tried to address it with the administration, but was dismissed and warned to keep quiet to preserve the school's reputation. "She's untouchable, Mr. Harper," Mrs. Brooks said, her voice filled with regret. "The administration has always protected her. She knows exactly how to play the system." Leo's jaw tightened as he listened. He thanked Mrs. Brooks, promising to keep her name out of it, but he knew he was dealing with a formidable opponent. Miss Carmichael wasn't just a teacher. She was an institution at Ridgefield, shielded by the school's reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. As Leo continued gathering evidence, he began formulating a plan. He knew that direct confrontation wouldn't work. The administration had already shown where its loyalties lay, and Miss Carmichael would deny everything if he approached her openly. No, this required a more strategic approach, a way to expose her actions so thoroughly that the school would have no choice but to act. He shared part of his plan with Zoe, encouraging her to stay strong and focused. "They can put you on probation, Zoe, but they can't silence the truth. We're going to make sure everyone sees who Miss Carmichael really is." Zoe nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with her father's support, she felt ready to face it. She was no longer a scared student trying to survive. She was a young woman ready to fight back. The following days at Ridgefield Academy felt like an emotional battlefield for Zoe. Every step she took down the hallways seemed heavier. Every classroom she entered felt colder. She could feel Miss Carmichael's presence, even when the teacher wasn't in sight, a lingering reminder that she was watching, waiting for Zoe to slip up again. Her probation status loomed over her like a dark cloud, a warning that any misstep could lead to harsher consequences. Zoe knew she couldn't let fear consume her, but the isolation was overwhelming. Her classmates had begun to distance themselves, worried that association with her might bring trouble. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Rumors spread, many of them seeded by Miss Carmichael's subtle but poisonous comments in class. Former friends avoided her gaze, pretending not to see her in the halls, and even those who once respected her seemed to view her with suspicion. It was as though Miss Carmichael had succeeded in making Zoe an outcast. Meanwhile, her father, Leo, was hard at work. He was spending hours on the phone, reaching out to every contact he had, trying to build a case. He knew that Miss Carmichael was no ordinary teacher. She was deeply embedded in the fabric of Ridgefield Academy, with allies in the administration and a carefully crafted reputation. To take her down would require more than just pointing out her mistreatment of Zoe. He needed a trail, a history of misconduct that would force the school's hand. Leo had already uncovered some complaints from former students and parents that had been brushed aside, subtle patterns of discriminatory treatment that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed. But he needed more. He needed something undeniable, something that would shake the administration to its core, and to find that he had to dig even deeper. One evening, Leo received a call from a former Ridgefield teacher, Mr. Alan Ross, who had retired years ago and moved out of state. Ross had heard about Zoe's situation through mutual acquaintances, and he offered his sympathy, mentioning that he was not surprised to hear Miss Carmichael's name involved in controversy. "She's been untouchable for years," Leo, Ross said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I once tried to report her behavior towards certain students, but the administration shut it down quickly. They told me that I was overreacting and that her teaching methods were just rigorous." "Did you keep any documentation? Anything that might back up those claims?" Leo asked, his voice calm but intense. There was a pause on the line. "I did, actually. I kept some of the disciplinary records and a few notes I'd made about incidents I witnessed. I didn't think they'd be of any use, but I felt compelled to hold on to them, just in case. If you're willing to come out here, I can give you copies of everything I have." Without hesitation, Leo made arrangements to travel to meet Mr. Ross. He knew that any evidence from a former colleague of Miss Carmichael's would be invaluable, especially if it showed a pattern of behavior. He could feel the pieces of his plan slowly falling into place, but he knew he had to proceed with caution. Miss Carmichael and the school administration would not go down without a fight. While Leo pursued his leads, Zoe was facing her own battles at Ridgefield. One morning, as she was putting books into her locker, she noticed a small note slip from the slits in the locker door. She looked around, making sure no one was watching, then picked it up. It was a folded piece of notebook paper with a single line scrawled across it. "Meet me in the library after last bell. I have something to tell you." There was no signature, no clue as to who had left the note. But Zoe's curiosity was piqued, and as the day wore on, she found herself growing more anxious to find out who had reached out to her and why. After the final bell rang, Zoe made her way to the library, heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, but saw only a few students studying quietly. Then, from behind one of the tall shelves, A figure stepped out. It was Lily Cheng, one of Zoe's classmates, and someone who had always been quiet and unassuming. "Lily?" Zoe asked, surprised. She and Lily had never been particularly close, but there was no animosity between them either. Lily glanced around nervously, making sure no one was listening. "Zoe, I don't know if I should be doing this, but I can't stay silent anymore. I've seen what's happening to you, and I know it's wrong." Zoe felt a surge of gratitude mixed with caution. "What do you mean?" Lily hesitated, as if gathering her thoughts. "Miss Carmichael, she's been doing this for years, Zoe. You're not the first one she's targeted. I remember my freshman year there was a student named Marcus. He was smart, outspoken, kind of like you. He challenged her on something during class, just a harmless question about history, and she tore into him. She made his life hell. Eventually he transferred schools because he couldn't take it anymore." Zoe's stomach tightened as she listened. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up about this?" Lily shrugged, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "People are afraid, Zoe. She has too much power here. And the administration always backs her up. Most students just learn to keep their heads down, to stay on her good side." Zoe nodded, her mind racing. She'd suspected that Miss Carmichael's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but hearing it confirmed by a fellow student made it even more real. "Thank you for telling me, Lily. I appreciate it." Lily glanced around one last time, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, tattered notebook. "I kept a record, you know. I wrote down some of the things she said in class, the way she treated certain students. I don't know if it'll help, but I thought you should have it." Zoe took the notebook, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was more than just a gesture of support. It was a piece of evidence, a record of the injustices Miss Carmichael had inflicted on her students. "Thank you, Lily. This means a lot." After parting ways with Lily, Zoe went home and immediately showed the notebook to her father. Leo flipped through the pages, his expression darkening as he read Lily's notes. There were descriptions of Miss Carmichael's degrading comments, her sarcastic remarks directed at certain students, and her blatant favoritism toward others. It was all there, written in Lily's neat handwriting, a silent testament to the cruelty Miss Carmichael had managed to conceal for so long. "This is exactly what we need," Leo said, nodding. "It's not enough on its own, but it supports everything we've found so far. This will help us show the administration that this isn't just a one-time incident. It's a pattern." In the days that followed, Leo continued to dig, pulling together every piece of evidence he could find. He compiled a dossier that included testimonies from former students, records from Mr. Ross, and Lily's notebook. As he pieced it all together, he began to see the full extent of Miss Carmichael's influence and how she had weaponized her authority over the years to manipulate and control students. Meanwhile, Zoe felt her confidence begin to return. With her father's support and the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her experiences, she started to regain her sense of purpose. She continued to attend Miss Carmichael's classes, refusing to give her teacher the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. She sat in the front row, unflinching, meeting Miss Carmichael's gaze head-on. One afternoon, as the class was wrapping up, Miss Carmichael called Zoe to stay behind. Zoe's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, determined not to show any fear. "Zoe," Miss Carmichael began, her tone dripping with condescension, "I understand that you and your father are unhappy with the way I run my classroom." Zoe clenched her fists but kept her expression neutral. "I think your methods are unfair and biased, yes." Miss Carmichael's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice calm. "Let me make something clear, Zoe. This is my classroom. I decide what's acceptable and what's not. If you or your father think you can change that, you're sorely mistaken. This school has been around long before you, and it will continue long after you're gone. Zoe looked her teacher square in the eye, her voice steady. I may not be able to change you, Miss Carmichael, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you treat me or anyone else like this without standing up for myself. Miss Carmichael's mouth tightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Zoe could tell that her teacher wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a student. For the first time, it seemed like Miss Carmichael realized that Zoe wasn't going to back down. Be careful, Zoe, Miss Carmichael warned, her voice low. You're on probation. One wrong step, and you'll find yourself out of this school faster than you can say history lesson. Zoe felt a surge of anger but kept her composure. Then I guess I'll have to make every step count. With that, she turned and walked out of the classroom, feeling a newfound sense of empowerment. She knew this wasn't over, that Miss Carmichael would likely retaliate in ways she couldn't yet predict. But she also knew she had allies now, people who were willing to stand by her side and support her fight for justice. That evening, Leo finalized his plan. He scheduled a meeting with Principal Edwards, prepared to present everything he had gathered. He knew that simply showing the principal a stack of papers wouldn't be enough. He needed to make an impact, to convey the seriousness of Miss Carmichael's actions in a way that the administration couldn't ignore. When the day of the meeting arrived, Zoe and Leo entered the principal's office together, armed not just with evidence but with determination. Principal Edwards looked up as they entered, his expression guarded. Mr. Harper, Zoe, he greeted them, gesturing for them to sit. I understand you've requested this meeting to discuss some concerns regarding Miss Carmichael. Leo placed the dossier on the principal's desk. This is more than just a concern, Principal Edwards. This is a documented history of discrimination, manipulation, and abuse of power. It's time the school acknowledges what's been happening and takes action. Principal Edwards opened the dossier, his expression shifting as he flipped through the pages. Zoe watched as he read Lily's notebook, the testimonies from former students, and the disciplinary records. She could see the discomfort in his eyes, the way he shifted in his seat as he realized the extent of Miss Carmichael's actions. After a few minutes of silence, he looked up, his face pale. This is serious. Yes, it is, Leo replied, his voice calm but firm. And if the school refuses to address it, I'll have no choice but to take this to the school board and the media, if necessary. Principal Edwards looked between Leo and Zoe, clearly conflicted. Please, Mr. Harper, let's not make any hasty decisions. I assure you, the school will investigate this thoroughly. Leo leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. No, Principal Edwards. This isn't about investigation anymore. It's about accountability. You've had the power to stop this for years, and you chose not to. Now it's time to make things right. Principal Edwards swallowed, his confidence visibly shaken. He knew that Ridgefield's reputation was on the line, and that this wouldn't simply disappear. With a resigned nod, he promised to take immediate action, placing Miss Carmichael on administrative leave pending a full review. As Zoe and Leo left the office, a weight lifted from Zoe's shoulders. They had finally cracked the shield that had protected Miss Carmichael for so long. This was only the beginning. But for the first time, Zoe felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that justice was within reach. The day after their meeting with Principal Edwards, Zoe walked into Ridgegale Academy with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. News had already begun to ripple through the school's corridors. Miss Carmichael had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Students and teachers alike whispered in hushed tones, trying to piece together what could have possibly led to such an unprecedented action against one of the school's longest tenured and most feared teachers. For Zoe, this was a small but powerful victory, one that she had fought hard to achieve. But she knew this was only the beginning. Ridgefield's administration had been forced to take action, but she was well aware that the system would do everything it could to contain the situation, to avoid tarnishing the school's image. This was no guaranteed path to justice, it was merely the opening move in what was likely to be a drawn-out battle. As Zoe made her way to her locker, she noticed the shifting glances of her classmates. Some avoided eye contact, unsure of how to act around her now that she'd become the catalyst for such a controversial event. Others looked at her with newfound respect, even admiration, recognizing the courage it had taken to stand up against Miss Carmichael. And yet there were also those who resented her, seeing her actions as a disruption to the school's carefully maintained order. Later that day, during lunch, a few students she barely knew approached her table. Among them was Alex Ford, one of the popular seniors, known for his involvement in sports and student council. Alex was someone Zoe had seen around but had never spoken to directly. "Hey Zoe," Alex began, his tone cautious but friendly. "We heard about what happened with Miss Carmichael. That took a lot of guts." Zoe looked up, wary but appreciative of the support. "Thanks, Alex. It wasn't easy, but it needed to be done." He nodded, glancing at the other students who had gathered. "A few of us, well, we were talking, and we wanted to know if you need any help. I know you probably feel like you're on your own right now, but you're not. A lot of people here are starting to realize how unfair she's been to some of us." Zoe was taken aback by the unexpected offer. She had prepared herself to stand alone, to fight without allies, but now, hearing Alex's words, she felt a surge of hope. Perhaps there were more people willing to stand up than she had realized. "I appreciate that," Zoe said, looking at each of them in turn. "But this isn't just about Miss Carmichael's Carl. It's about the way the school lets teachers get away with this kind of behavior year after year. She's been treating students unfairly for as long as I can remember, and no one's done anything about it until now." Alex nodded, his expression serious. "We know, and maybe it's time for that to change." One of the other students, a girl named Hannah who had been a quiet presence in the group, spoke up. "I had Miss Carmichael in freshman year. She humiliated me in front of the whole class because I didn't know the answer to a question. I still think about it every time I raise my hand in class. It's like she made it her mission to break anyone who didn't fit her mold." Zoe listened, anger and empathy mingling within her. She realized that Miss Carmichael's cruelty had left scars on many of the students, some of whom had been carrying those wounds in silence for years. She knew then that this fight wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who had ever suffered under Miss Carmichael's rule. "Thank you for telling me, Hannah," Zoe said, her voice soft but resolute. "This isn't over yet. They might have put her on leave, but the administration is going to do everything it can to come sweep this under the rug. We have to make sure they don't." Over the next few days, Zoe, Alex, and the small group of students began to strategize. They shared stories, each recounting their own experiences with Miss Carmichael's abusive tactics. Some of them had been on the receiving end of her disdainful remarks, while others had witnessed her belittling students who dared to challenge her authority. As they spoke, they realized that they had a wealth of testimonies that could be used to build a stronger case. Together, they decided to draft a petition demanding a full investigation not only into Miss Carmichael's behavior, but also into the administration's complicity in allowing her actions to continue unchecked. They knew that a written record of grievances, supported by multiple students, would be harder for the school to ignore. The petition would serve as a collective voice, amplifying their concerns beyond a single accusation. However, the moment they began circulating the petition, the school's administration responded with surprising speed and hostility. By the end of the day, Principal Edwards had issued an announcement that any unauthorized petitions were prohibited on school grounds, citing a policy about maintaining academic focus and preventing disruptions. Zoe and her friends were warned that further attempts to distribute or promote the petition could result in disciplinary action. The move only strengthened their resolve. It became clear that the administration was more concerned with protecting the school's reputation than with addressing the students' legitimate grievances. They were willing to suppress any dissent, even if it meant punishing the students who were speaking out against an abusive teacher. After discussing their options, Zoe and her allies decided to take their efforts off campus. They created a digital version of the petition, which could be shared through social media and email. This allowed them to reach a broader audience, including alumni and parents who might be willing to support their cause. Within hours of going live, the petition began to gain traction, with signatures pouring in from current students, former students, and even some concerned parents. But it wasn't long before the administration caught wind of the online petition. Zoe was called into the principal's office once again, this time facing not only Principal Edwards but also the school's legal counsel, Mr. Graham. The atmosphere in the office was tense, and Zoe could feel the weight of their disapproval bearing down on her. "Zoe," Principal Edwards began, his tone cold and formal, "this petition is a direct violation of school policy. You've created a disruptive environment, both on campus and online, and this behavior cannot continue." Zoe met his gaze, her voice steady. "With all due respect, Principal Edwards, the real disruption here is Miss Carmichael's behavior. Students have been suffering because of her actions for years, and the school has done nothing to stop it. We're just trying to make sure our voices are heard." Mr. Graham leaned forward, his expression stern. "Miss Harper, you need to understand that the school has policies in place for handling grievances. If you or any other students have concerns, you should bring them to the administration directly, not through public forums that damage the school's reputation." Zoe fought to keep her anger in check. "I tried going through the administration. I followed the rules and nothing changed. Miss Carmichael was only placed on leave because we forced the issue, and now you're trying to silence us instead of addressing the problem." Principal Edwards exchanged a glance with Mr. Graham, then sighed. "Zoe, we're willing to offer a compromise. If you agree to take down the petition and cease all efforts to spread it, we'll ensure that the investigation into Miss Carmichael proceeds with due diligence. But if you continue to defy school policy, we may have to reconsider your position here at Ridgefield." Zoe felt a surge of defiance. She knew they were trying to intimidate her, to make her back down. But she also knew that taking down the petition would be a betrayal of everything she had fought for. She thought about her father, about Lily, about Alex and Hannah, and all the others who had joined her in this battle. They were counting on her to see this through. With a calm she barely felt, Zoe looked Principal Edwards in the eye. "I'm not taking it down. We deserve to have our voices heard, and if Ridgefield isn't willing to listen, then we'll find someone who will." Principal Edwards' expression hardened, and Zoe could see the finality in his gaze. "Very well. You leave us no choice." The following day, Zoe received an official letter from the school, notifying her of her suspension for conduct detrimental to the school environment. The administration cited her repeated refusal to comply with school policies and her deliberate attempts to disrupt academic integrity as grounds for the suspension. It was clear that they were trying to make an example of her, to show the rest of the students what would happen if they dared to stand up against the system. When Zoe shared the news with her father, Leo's reaction was one of both pride and anger. He knew how much this suspension would hurt Zoe academically, but he also understood the courage it had taken for her to stay true to her principles. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and told her that they would face this together. But Leo wasn't content to merely support his daughter from the sidelines. He saw Ridgefield's actions as a blatant abuse of power, and he knew that if they didn't push back, the school would continue to silence any voices of dissent. Determined to fight fire with fire, Leo reached out to several high-profile contacts in education and civil rights, sharing Zoe's story and the evidence they had gathered. Within days, word of Zoe's suspension spread beyond the school's walls. Journalists from local news outlets began contacting the Harpers, eager to cover the story of a student who had been suspended for standing up against an abusive teacher and an unyielding administration. Parents in the community, some of whom had never paid much attention to school politics, were suddenly aware of the scandal unfolding within Ridgefield's pristine halls. In a matter of days, what Ridgefield had tried so hard to contain became a public issue, with reporters and activists calling for an investigation into the school's handling of the situation. Parents began questioning the administration, demanding transparency and accountability. A few parents even threatened to pull their children out of Ridgefield if the school didn't take immediate action to rectify the situation. Under mounting pressure, Ridgefield's Board of Trustees convened an emergency meeting. They were acutely aware that the school's reputation was at stake, and that their previous attempts to suppress the issue had only intensified the public outcry. After hours of deliberation, they reached a decision. Miss Carmichael's administrative leave would be extended indefinitely, pending a comprehensive review of her actions and her treatment of students over the years. Zoe's suspension was lifted, and she was formally invited to return to school. The administration, now fully aware of the scrutiny they faced, assured the Harpers that they would make significant changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Principal Edwards, visibly strained and humbled by the ordeal, apologized to Zoe and her father, though his words felt forced and insincere. Zoe returned to Ridgefield with her head held high, knowing that she had achieved something meaningful. She had forced the school to confront its own failures, to look beyond its reputation and see the damage it had allowed to persist for so long. And she had done it not only for herself but for every student who had ever suffered in silence. In the weeks that followed, the administration announced new policies aimed at fostering a safer and more inclusive environment. They established a student-led committee to address grievances, ensuring that students would have a voice in their own education. Zoe was asked to join the committee, an acknowledgement of the courage and resilience she had shown throughout the ordeal. Though the battle had been exhausting, Zoe knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. She had learned the power of her own voice, the strength of standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. And as she sat among her peers, guiding them through discussions on justice and fairness, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. As Ridgefield Academy attempted to rebuild its reputation in the wake of the scandal, Zoe felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. But she also knew that the fight was far from over. Miss Carmichael might have been placed on indefinite leave, and the administration might have promised reforms, but the institution still held deeply embedded prejudices and a vested interest in protecting its own. Over the weeks following her reinstatement, Zoe began to notice subtle signs that the administration was not entirely sincere about their promises. The new student-led committee on which Zoe served was clearly intended to be a symbolic gesture rather than a powerful tool for change. The meetings were heavily monitored by faculty members, who quickly shut down any discussions that ventured into uncomfortable territory. Suggestions were brushed aside or deferred for future consideration. Frustrated, Zoe realized that Ridgefield was content to make superficial adjustments without addressing the root issues that had allowed people like Miss Carmichael to flourish unchecked. Leo, however, had not forgotten about the fight. The administration's lukewarm response to the students' grievances had only strengthened his resolve. He suspected that the school's board of trustees was simply waiting for the controversy to die down so they could quietly reinstate Miss Carmichael. He knew that his daughter's battle was against a powerful institution that valued its reputation above all else, and he was determined to ensure that Ridgefield couldn't sweep the problem under the rug. One evening, as they discussed the latest student committee meeting, Leo turned to Zoe with a steely look in his eyes. "Zoe, I think it's time we dig a little deeper. Ridgefield's not going to change on its own. We need to find something that will make it impossible for them to ignore us." Zoe looked at her father, curious. "What do you mean, Dad? We already have a lot of evidence. They can't just ignore what happened." Leo leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "We've only scratched the surface. There's more to this than just Miss Carmichael. If she's been protected by the administration for years, then there has to be a reason. I suspect there's a pattern here, something bigger that ties her actions to a broader culture of discrimination and silence within the school. We need to expose that if we want real change." Zoe nodded, feeling a surge of determination. Her father's words resonated with her. She had sensed all along that Ridgefield's problems went far beyond a single teacher. Together, they formulated a plan to gather evidence of the administration's systemic neglect and bias, something that would force the board and the public to take notice. Leo decided to reach out to a few more parents who had children in Ridgefield, some of whom had been victims of subtle discrimination themselves. He compiled stories from parents of students who had been bullied, belittled, or ignored by teachers when they raised concerns. Some parents admitted that their children had been afraid to speak up for fear of retribution, a fear that had silenced them for years. Through his connections, Leo managed to secure a meeting with a prominent civil rights lawyer, Marcus Reed, who had built a career fighting for justice in education. Reed was known for his fierce commitment to challenging institutions that perpetuated inequality. When Leo shared Zoe's story and the mounting evidence of Ridgefield's discrimination, Reed agreed to take on the case. Ridgefield's been operating under the assumption that they can control everything within their walls, Reed said, his eyes sharp with resolve. But they can't ignore the law. If we can show a consistent pattern of neglect and discriminatory practices, we can force them into a position where they have to make real changes or face legal consequences. While Leo and Reed prepared their case, Zoe continued her work within the school. Although the administration tried to undermine her efforts, Zoe became even more determined to make her voice heard. She and her allies Alex, Hannah, Lily, and other students who had experienced mistreatment began organizing informal gatherings outside of school, where they could speak freely without fear of censorship. At these gatherings, students shared their stories in a safe environment. Some told of teachers who had ignored or mocked them, while others recounted incidents where faculty members dismissed their complaints. It was eye-opening for many of them, as they realized just how widespread the problem was. Each story added fuel to Zoe's fire. She felt the weight of responsibility to ensure that their voices would not go unheard. One evening, as they gathered in Zoe's living room, Hannah spoke up with a revelation that stunned the group. "I found something in the school archives," she began, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. There was a case in the early 2000s. A family filed a complaint against Ridgefield because their daughter had experienced severe discrimination. The school settled out of court, and it was all kept quiet. Zoe's eyes widened. "How did you find this?" "I was helping in the library after school, and I stumbled across an old file in the digital archives. It was buried deep in the system, not easy to find. But the documents were there: a confidentiality agreement, settlement papers, and a letter from the administration to the family. Alex, who was sitting nearby, looked thoughtful. If Ridgefield's been covering up incidents like this for years, then they've probably been doing it to protect their reputation. This wasn't just about Miss Carmichael. It's a pattern. Zoe realized they were onto something bigger than she had imagined. If Ridgefield had a history of silencing complaints through confidential settlements, it meant the school's reputation was built on a foundation of buried secrets. With this information, they could finally show that the administration's negligence and discrimination were systemic. The group decided to investigate further. They worked late into the night, combing through online records, archival files, and even old news articles. Leo helped them, using his investigative skills to track down families who had once been part of Ridgefield, but had quietly left after experiencing mistreatment. They found more cases: families who had left the school under suspicious circumstances, students who had mysteriously disappeared from yearbooks, and faint whispers of complaints that had been settled before they could reach the public eye. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Ridgefield Academy had built a legacy of academic excellence at the expense of fairness and integrity. The school's administration had consistently prioritized its reputation over the well-being of its students, using settlements and intimidation tactics to keep its image untarnished. As their evidence grew, Marcus Reed advised them to prepare for a formal legal case. He wanted to pressure the school into publicly acknowledging its wrongdoing and implementing tangible reforms. "This isn't just about one teacher or even one student," Reed explained to Zoe and her friends. "It's about holding an institution accountable for years of harm. Ridgefield has a duty to protect its students, and they've repeatedly failed in that duty." When the school administration learned of the impending lawsuit, they went into full crisis mode. Principal Edwards and members of the board began reaching out to families, trying to reassure them that the situation was under control. They hosted a special assembly where Principal Edwards addressed the student body, claiming that the school was committed to improving its policies and that recent events had been misunderstandings blown out of proportion. But Zoe wasn't swayed. She saw through their empty promises and wasn't willing to settle for superficial gestures. As the lawsuit loomed over Ridgefield, she knew that they needed something even more powerful to ensure lasting change, something that would make it impossible for the administration to dismiss or minimize the damage they had caused. Then, in an unexpected twist, a former teacher, Mrs. Eliza Bryant, came forward. Mrs. Bryant had worked at Ridgefield for over a decade before she left, disillusioned with the school's culture. She reached out to Zoe's family through a mutual connection, offering to share her story as a witness. When Zoe and Leo met with Mrs. Bryant, she revealed that she had seen firsthand how Ridgefield's administration protected favored staff members while punishing students who didn't fit their ideal image. She had documented incidents of discriminatory practices that she had reported to her superiors, only to be met with dismissal or even threats to her own job. "Miss Carmichael isn't the only one," Mrs. Bryant explained. "There were others teachers who were encouraged to be strict with certain students while ignoring or excusing the actions of others. And it wasn't just students of color, though they were the most common targets. It was anyone who didn't conform to Ridgefield's vision." With Mrs. Bryant's testimony, the case against Ridgefield grew stronger. Marcus Reed worked tirelessly to assemble a powerful legal argument, gathering evidence of the administration's long-standing negligence and their systematic approach to suppressing complaints. The case was shaping up to be a landmark lawsuit, one that could potentially force Ridgefield to overhaul its policies and hold the administration accountable. As the trial date approached, the tension at Ridgefield Academy became palpable. Parents, students, and faculty members were divided. Some sided with the administration, believing that the school's reputation was being unfairly tarnished, while others rallied behind Zoe and the other students who had suffered in silence for so long. The student body was more energized than ever, with many students publicly supporting Zoe and sharing their own experiences. Then, just days before the trial, Ridgefield's Board of Trustees made a surprising move. They announced that Principal Edwards would resigned to pursue other opportunities and that Miss Carmichael had officially been terminated. They also issued a statement promising to conduct a full internal review of the school's policies on discrimination, bullying, and misconduct. They assured the public that Ridgefield was committed to creating a safe and inclusive environment for all students. But for Zoe, Leo, and their allies, this wasn't enough. They knew that Ridgefield was trying to make a preemptive strike to avoid the public scrutiny that would come with a trial. They understood that the administration's actions were meant to protect the institution, not to deliver justice for those who had been wronged. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with parents, journalists, and members of the community. Zoe took the stand, sharing her story with a quiet strength that left a profound impact on everyone in the room. She spoke not only of her own experiences but also of the countless students who had suffered because Ridgefield's administration had chosen to prioritize reputation over responsibility. Mrs. Bryant testified as well, revealing the inner workings of Ridgefield's discriminatory practices and the ways the administration had silenced teachers who dared to speak out. Her words painted a damning picture of a school that had fostered a culture of fear and compliance, where those who didn't fit the mold were cast aside. As the testimonies piled up, the Board of Trustees realized they had underestimated the impact of the trial. The public backlash grew with every revelation, and Ridgefield's reputation suffered an irreparable blow. Parents began withdrawing their children, alumni publicly condemned the school, and donors pulled their support. In the end, Ridgefield Academy was forced to settle the case, agreeing to a series of sweeping reforms. They implemented mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, established an independent committee to oversee student grievances, and offered reparations to the families affected by the school's negligence. But for Zoe, the victory wasn't about the money or the policy changes. It was about knowing that her fight had brought light to a dark corner of Ridgefield's history. She had taken on an institution that seemed unbreakable and proved that one voice, when joined by others, could make a difference. She had inspired her peers to stand up for themselves, to refuse to be silenced, and to demand respect and justice. The trial marked the end of Zoe's time at Ridgefield, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She knew that her journey was only starting and that there would be more battles ahead. But she had learned a powerful lesson that courage and integrity were worth more than any institution's approval. With Leo by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that her story was far from over. The trial's final week was unlike anything Ridgefield Academy had ever experienced. The once pristine reputation of the school was now tarnished by daily headlines that exposed its failures. Parents who had paid exorbitant tuition fees for their children to attend this elite institution were now questioning whether their investment had been worth it. Alumni who had proudly boasted of their Ridgefield education began distancing themselves from the scandal, and the tension among faculty members was palpable. For Zoe, stepping into the courtroom for the final hearing was a moment she would never forget. She had spent weeks sharing her story, enduring cross-examinations, and reliving the humiliation inflicted upon her by Miss Carmichael. Each day she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. This was no longer just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced by an unjust system. Her father, Leo, was by her side every step of the way. His unwavering support had been her anchor throughout the ordeal. Together they had taken on a system designed to protect the powerful and succeeded in making cracks in its seemingly impenetrable walls. The courtroom was packed that day. Students, parents, teachers, and journalists filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the judge, who sat at the front of the room, looking over the evidence one last time. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made every whispered conversation feel amplified. The school's legal counsel, Mr. Graham, rose first to deliver the closing argument on behalf of Ridgefield Academy. He was composed but clearly strained, his arguments carefully tailored to minimize the damage while maintaining an air of remorse. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "Ridgefield Academy acknowledges that mistakes were made. Miss Carmichael's actions were regrettable, and the administration's response, while well-intentioned, may not have been sufficient to address the harm caused. However, we must not lose sight of the fact that Ridgefield is a cornerstone of academic excellence, an institution that has served this community for decades. We ask the court to consider the school's contributions to the education and development of thousands of students, and to recognize that this situation, while serious, does not define Ridgefield as a whole." Zoe watched him, her jaw tightening. Even now, the school was more concerned with its legacy than with acknowledging the full scope of its failures. It was clear that the priority was damage control, not accountability. When it was Marcus Reed's turn to speak, he walked to the center of the room with the confidence of a man who had spent years dismantling institutional power structures. He paused, scanning the room, ensuring that every eye was on him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm and resonant, "this case is not about a single teacher's misconduct. It's not even about a single student's experience. This case is about a culture that prioritizes reputation over responsibility, that silences those who dare to speak out, and that perpetuates harm under the guise of tradition and excellence." He turned toward the judge. "Miss Carmichael may have been the catalyst, but Ridgefield Academy allowed her to thrive. For years, the administration ignored complaints, buried settlements, and dismissed the concerns of students and parents who sought justice. This is not negligence, this is complicity." Reid gestured toward Zoe, who sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in her lap. Zoe Harper had the courage to stand up when so many others could not. She faced humiliation, isolation, and intimidation, and yet she persisted. She represents the countless students who have been silenced by Ridgefield's system, and she deserves not only justice but assurance that no other student will have to endure what she did. As Reed continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted. His words carried weight, resonating with everyone present. Parents exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Even Principal Edwards, who sat stiffly in the audience, couldn't hide the discomfort on his face. When Reed finished, there was a moment of profound silence before the judge spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Reid. Before I issue my decision, I would like to hear one final statement from Miss Zoe Harper." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to be called upon again, but she stood without hesitation. This was her moment to speak directly to everyone in the room: the judge, the administration, her peers, and the wider community. She walked to the stand, her steps steady, and faced the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "When I first spoke out in Miss Carmichael's classroom, I wasn't trying to start a fight. I wasn't trying to disrupt the school or challenge its authority. I was just asking for honesty, for truth." She paused, meeting the eyes of the judge, then the audience. "What happened after that taught me that Ridgefield values silence over truth. When I questioned Miss Carmichael, I wasn't just punished, I was made an example of. They wanted to show me, and everyone else, what happens when you don't follow their rules. But their rules were wrong. Zoe's voice grew stronger as she continued. This isn't just about me. It's about every student who was ever told to keep quiet, every parent who was ignored, and every teacher who was forced to look the other way. Ridgefield failed us. And if we don't hold them accountable now, they'll keep failing future students too. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the podium. I love learning. I believe in education. But education should be about growth, about challenging ideas and discovering the truth, not about fear and conformity. Ridgefield has the chance to be better, to make real changes, and I hope they take it. But if they don't, we'll keep fighting. Because this isn't just about Ridgefield, it's about justice. When Zoe finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to clap. It started with a few parents in the back, then spread to the students and teachers, until the entire room was filled with applause. Zoe returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but a sense of pride swelling within her. She had spoken her truth, and no one could take that away from her. The judge called for order and took a few moments to review her notes before delivering the verdict. This court finds Ridgefield Academy liable for failing to address systemic discrimination and negligence in its policies and practices. The evidence presented has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that has caused significant harm to its students, and the court orders Ridgefield Academy to implement the following corrective measures. As the judge outlined the mandated reforms, Zoe felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The school was required to overhaul its grievance system, provide mandatory diversity training for all staff, and establish an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability. Financial reparations were also awarded to Zoe and several other families who had been affected by Ridgefield's negligence. But the most significant outcome came at the very end. The judge issued a stern warning to Ridgefield's Board of Trustees, making it clear that any future incidents would result in even harsher legal consequences. It was a message not just to Ridgefield but to every institution that thought it could get away with prioritizing its reputation over its students. As the courtroom emptied, Zoe stood with her father, surrounded by her friends and allies. Alex, Hannah, Lily, and the others who had supported her hugged her tightly, their faces glowing with pride and relief. Marcus Reed shook her hand, congratulating her on her bravery and resilience. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for statements. Zoe hesitated, overwhelmed by the attention. But Leo gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've got this, kid," he said with a smile. Zoe stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the same strength and clarity she had shown in the courtroom. This fight wasn't just about one teacher or one school. It was about making sure that every student everywhere knows they have a right to be treated with respect and dignity. And it's about showing that when we stand together, we can make change happen. Her words were met with cheers and applause, and as the crowd began to disperse, Zoe felt a profound sense of closure. The battle had been long and difficult, but they had won. Ridgefield would never be the same, and she had proven that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. As she walked away with her father, she looked up at him and smiled. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." Leo chuckled. "You didn't need me, Zoe. You had this all along." She nodded, her confidence renewed. "Maybe. But it's nice to know I'm not alone." The fight might have been over, but Zoe knew her journey was just beginning. There would always be more battles to fight, more voices to lift, and more truths to uncover. And now, she was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the trial were transformative for Ridgefield Academy, its students, and especially Zoe. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the community, forcing the school to reckon with its deep-seated flaws. As the mandated reforms began taking shape, Ridgefield's once untouchable aura of prestige now bore the scars of public accountability. For Zoe, the experience had been life-changing. The fight had cost her dearly, but it had also shown her the power of persistence and collective action. Back at school, Zoe noticed immediate changes. Teachers who once ignored or tolerated discrimination seemed to tread carefully, no longer confident they could act without consequence. The student body, once divided by fear and silence, began to open up. Discussions about fairness, equality, and accountability that had once been taboo now took center stage in classrooms, hallways, and student groups. One of the most significant changes was the creation of the Student Advocacy Board, an independent body where students could voice their concerns directly to the administration. Zoe had been invited to serve as its inaugural president, a role she initially hesitated to accept, unsure if she could take on such a responsibility after all she'd been through. But after some encouragement from her father and friends, she agreed, recognizing the opportunity to ensure no one else would endure what she had. In her first meeting as president, Zoe sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her peers. Among them were students like Alex and Hannah, who had stood by her during the most challenging moments of her fight. The room was filled with a renewed sense of purpose as they discussed ways to improve the school environment, from ensuring teacher accountability to creating a more inclusive curriculum. Zoe realized that this wasn't just a victory for her, it was the beginning of something much larger. Meanwhile, Ridgefield's administration underwent significant upheaval. Principal Edwards resigned shortly after the trial, his reputation irreparably damaged. He was replaced by Dr. Lillian Carter, a seasoned educator known for her progressive approach to leadership. Dr. Carter wasted no time implementing the court-ordered reforms, meeting with students and parents to rebuild trust and set a new tone for the school. One day, Dr. Carter called Zoe into her office. "Zoe," she began, her tone warm but serious, "I want you to know that what you did wasn't just brave, it was revolutionary. Ridgefield has always prided itself on excellence, but you reminded us that excellence means nothing without integrity. Thank you for holding us accountable." Zoe nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "So many people helped me get here. And that's what makes it even more powerful," Dr. Carter said. "This wasn't just your fight, it was a movement." As life at Ridgefield began to settle into a new normal, Zoe found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about Miss Carmichael, who had been stripped of her teaching credentials and quietly left the state. While Zoe didn't revel in her former teacher's downfall, she felt a sense of justice knowing that Carmichael would no longer wield her authority to harm others. Zoe also thought about her father, whose unwavering support had been her greatest strength throughout the ordeal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, she turned to him. "Dad, do you think Ridgefield will really change? Or will they just find new ways to hide their problems?" Leo leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Change is hard, Zoe. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people willing to fight for it. What you've done is force them to take the first step. The rest is up to the people who come after you." Zoe nodded, letting his words sink in. She realized that while her fight at Ridgefield might be over, her broader fight for justice and equality was only beginning. The experience had ignited something in her, a desire to use her voice and her strength to challenge injustice wherever she saw it. At the end of the school year, Ridgefield held its annual awards ceremony. Zoe had no expectations of recognition. Her journey had been about principle, not accolades. But as the event drew to a close, Dr. Carter took the stage to present a new award. The Courage in Leadership Award, created to honor students who demonstrated extraordinary bravery in advocating for positive change. This year, Dr. Carter announced, her voice steady and full of pride, we recognize a student who reminded us all of the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. Zoe Harper, please join me on stage. The auditorium erupted into applause as Zoe rose from her seat, her heart pounding. She made her way to the stage, feeling the support of her peers and the validation of her efforts. As Dr. Carter handed her the award, Zoe turned to the audience, her voice clear and confident. This award isn't just for me, she began, holding the plaque tightly. It's for everyone who has ever felt silenced, for everyone who has ever been told their voice doesn't matter. It's for every student who believes that schools should be places of learning, growth, and fairness. I hope that what we've started here at Ridgefield is just the beginning, and that we all continue to hold each other accountable and strive for a better future. The applause that followed was deafening, and as Zoe stepped off the stage, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The fight had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. As the summer approached, Zoe prepared for her next chapter. She planned to spend her break volunteering with a local organization dedicated to promoting equity in education, using her experience at Ridgefield to help other students who faced similar struggles. Her work with the Student Advocacy Board had inspired her to consider a future in law or activism, and she felt more determined than ever to make a difference. One evening, as she packed her bag for her first day at the organization, she found herself reflecting on the journey she'd been through. She thought about the moments of doubt, the nights spent crying, the fear of retaliation, and the weight of responsibility. But she also thought about the courage she'd found within herself, the friendships she'd forged, and the knowledge that her actions had created real change. "Ready, kid?" Leo's voice broke her reverie as he leaned against the doorframe. Zoe turned to him, smiling. "Yeah, I'm ready." As they headed out the door, Zoe felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew she wasn't the same person she had been when it all began. She was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to stand up for what was right. And with her father's words echoing in her mind, change doesn't happen without people willing to fight for it, she walked confidently toward the future, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead.